let me just start with just a very thumbnail history on the 25th Amendment. Was initiated in 1965, sent to the states because it was a constitutional amendment, and ratified in 1967. It augments Article 2, Section 1, which refers to presidential succession, and it is about what happens in the event of presidential and vice presidential incapacity. But I want to pose to the two medical experts the question which was first posed by John Dickinson in 1787 during the Constitutional Convention regarding Article 2, Section 1, which describes presidential succession. What is the extent of the term disability, and who shall be the judge of it? Said Dickinson presciently. To which I would add, does disability mean stroke, coma, gunshot, or can it be something more? And Sally, we'll start with you.
Well, I think disability can definitely be something more. You have to think about it in the context of the person and the demands upon them. And certainly if one's mental functioning is impaired, and I realize that leaves, that's a big gray area as well, is, where you draw the line on what's impairment. But in that general domain of mental function and emotional function, that I would extend disability to that realm as well. So,
and Bandy, you've given this quite
I would
a bit of thought.
agree. I think medical evidence shows that psychological impairment is no less debilitating, no less real, evidence-based, and objectively observable as physical impairment. And psychiatric diagnoses also are among the most reliable in medicine. So there's no reason to consider psychological impairment to be more subjective or slippery slope than physical impairment.
Okay, so let's go back a little bit, and I will channel Representative Raskin a little bit. He is before he was in the Congress, he's a professor at law at American University, a constitutional law scholar. So the 25th Amendment was drafted after the Kennedy assassination, passed by Congress, and then ratified by the state referendum. 1965, 1967, we're in the middle of the Cold War. Although the question of succession had been one which had come into play at various times, it became a really critical issue during the Cold War when people were concerned not only about the possibility of the president being unable to perform his duty, but also what would happen if the entire government was disabled. And so people were thinking about what we now call continuity of government. So there were 4 sections to it. The filling of the vacancy in the case of the removal, death, or resignation of a president, the filling of the role of the vice president, a voluntary transfer, temporary transfer for hospitalization, medical testing, and things of that nature. And then Section 4, which is the transfer of the presidential powers and duties to the vice president, where the vice president and a majority of principal officers of the executive departments or such other body as Congress may provide. So Section 4 has never been invoked in 50 years. It wasn't even invoked after Ronald Reagan was shot. If Congress creates another body, then the powers of Congress with respect to the decision passes to that other body. But the trigger still is the vice president. And there is no specific threshold as to what this disability is. It can be medical, or it can be another form of disability. And this has been a very popular subject in fiction and television programs. The president is kidnapped, or there's something that happens which disables the president. So if you watch Homeland or 24 or Designated Survivor, you are very familiar with scenarios of that nature. Then the vice president, let's see, I have a little chart here. So the vice president is the trigger. And then the vice president needs to consult with the principal officers or the disability review body. And the principal officers would be members of the cabinet. That would be Senate, only Senate confirmed, although it could be people who are acting, and there need to be at least 8 of those. So there needs to be the vice president plus 8. Or the Congress can switch those powers over to this disability review body. Now, the disability review body can be appointed just for this purpose, or it could be a standing body. And perhaps Bandy can speak a little bit about Representative Raskin's proposal for a standing body. If they make the determination after this trigger, then the president can object. There's 4 days to respond, and then the Congress then gets all of the evidence, and the Congress must decide in 48 hours if in session, or 21 days if they're not in session. And Congress needs to have a 2/3 vote of each house. So you can see that this is really an uphill slog, and the vice president is the linchpin in this. And one question is, what were the framers of the 25th Amendment thinking with respect to the vice president? Because I think that one of the concerns was that could it be a vice presidential coup? Could also, if the president becomes aware, if he does not wish to step back, if he becomes aware that there are 8 members of the cabinet who are inclined to remove him from office, can he then sequentially just fire all 8 of them and replace them with loyalists? So this is fraught with peril in terms of conspiracy theories on both sides. And so I want to turn it back to the psychiatric experts as to what do you think is the role of expertise and what are the perils to physicians who might be engaged in this? And Bandy, we can start.
Should I go first? Well, I wanted to bring up 3 points as to the role of medical professionals in the 25th Amendment. And the 3 of them are the importance of boundaries. Secondly, within those boundaries, the responsibility of experts to educate. And then thirdly, the duty on the part of professionals not to abandon our primary responsibility to society. The Goldwater rule with respect to speaking about a public figure, that it should be acknowledged for what it is. It's actually an ethical rule. It's actually a mandate to act. Its purpose is to contribute to the improvement of the community and the betterment of public health by educating the public when you are asked about a public figure, but refraining from diagnosing without a personal examination and without authorization. Now, under the current presidency, the American Psychiatric Association modified the rule so as to expand the prohibitive part to even subsume the educational role that we were to take, so that keeping with the new rule, in fact, has meant that we could not speak about any aspect whatsoever about a public official. And I'll return to this to illustrate the problems with it. But that actually relates to the third point, which is the duty not to abandon our primary responsibility to society. As a professional, we have 2 primary responsibilities. That is to our patients and a separate responsibility to society. I think it's clear that the 25th Amendment is a political process, at least in my mind, as I think of it as a forensic psychiatrist. But it does not mean the decision has to be made in an uninformed way. Experts like myself make ourselves available for consultation, education, and recommendations. In fact, it's in our ethical guidelines that we contribute to public service by consulting with the 3 branches of the federal government. So just as a legal decision like disability, incompetence, or unfitness, these are legal decisions, by the way, these are almost inconceivable to make without medical consultation. And in fact, the courts often follow very closely the medical evaluation and input. So a political decision is better made with appropriate expert input. So I'm here to educate on that importance and to educate on what mental health professionals can offer, because often, just like legal professionals, politicians may not be aware of exactly what could be consulted on and what we could be available for. Mental health issues are very familiar to us, but interventions at a national scale are not. Politicians who have the power to intervene at a national scale do not know much about mental health aspects, and so a lot of communication could be helpful here. When we issue a warning or take steps to protect public health, we're actually responding to our professional responsibility to society. And so that actually needs to be kept separate, in my mind, from the consultation that we are requested to do and the questions we're asked to answer. Those need to be contained within the parameters of the political process. But then we also have a responsibility to society, that we protect public health and that we call on Congress or the cabinet who have the power to act to address our concerns when they get to the point of affecting public well-being and public health, and to meet their constitutionally designated responsibility to protect the public.
Distinction between the role of the physician treating individual patients and that physician-patient relationship, and then the social role of psychiatrists, and whether perhaps the approach that you are describing, does it conflate the two? And maybe I'll ask Sally, who I think probably would say maybe yes, to speak to that.
Well, I do think, I agree with many of I think you listed 3 duties of psychiatry, and I think the third is really contentious. I mean, it's one thing to be consulted and to be asked to be in an advisory role, but it's another to step forward and be proactive about it, which is what you did and what you obviously feel comfortable with, and that's how you interpret the mandate of the profession. Vandy has talked about duty to warn, which is a concept and a reality and a law now called Tarasoff. Pardon me? Yeah. Yes, and which is to say, when a doctor has a relationship with a patient and he or she has good reason to think that patient will harm a third party, to inform that third party and/or officials. It doesn't extend, and I know you're doing kind of a more a broader reading of that to say that extends to people or figures who are not your patient. I have a much more narrow reading of what professionals should be doing, which is just that, to wait to be asked. You can always get around the Goldwater rule. It actually was expanded, Meryl, so that it's beyond you can't diagnose, which I would argue is irrelevant. But you can't even talk about them, and you've mentioned that. But my view is much more narrow. You should wait to be asked, and we're talking about outside psychiatrists. Heaven knows inside the White House what's going on. I mean, if they're really concerned about someone's health, mental or physical, they're already getting their consultations. But and in that role of consultation, what's most important, it seems to me, when we're talking about a public figure as opposed to a patient, And this person, of course, if it's a president or whatever, a governor, is both a patient and a public figure. From the patient standpoint, it's right. What is a diagnosis here? What's the treatment? And what's the prognosis? But to me, it's that third part, the prognosis, that is most important in the public realm. Whatever it is we're worried about that is impairing this person's capacity to do their job and discharge those duties, we want to know if it's going to go on. And that, to me, is one of the most relevant things an advisor can tell the people in politics who need to who are the ultimate decision makers here. When I say the diagnosis doesn't matter, it doesn't. It matters to, if you're as a patient, you damn well want to know what the diagnosis is. You want to know if it's depression in the context of unipolar depression versus bipolar depression, because that might affect the medications we give. But from the standpoint of observing the public figure, let's just stick with the depression now. If the person is too depressed, has no energy, can't act, has something that, I assume we still have the term pseudo-dementia, but a level of depression that actually affects cognitive capacity, so people can't really pay attention, can't concentrate, can't think through problems in an acute way, that's all observable, whether we call it depression or not. We want to know it's depression from the standpoint of the individual because we have to treat that person. But from the standpoint of whether someone can discharge their responsibilities, those are basically based on the symptoms or the manifestations, the behaviors and the dispositions we see in front of us, which in the case of character pathology and the media these days is on display for the world to see. No one needs a psychiatrist to come along and say the same things that, frankly, the public has observed.
Don't you think we have special knowledge that we can share?
Yes, but I would do it. Yes, I do. Mm-hmm. But the way I would do that, and I've written articles too. I never examined Andrea Yates, for example, the woman, the Houston mom in 2001 who drowned her 5 kids in a bathtub because she was afraid the devil was going to inhabit them. But I've written about Andrea Yates and others, but it takes the form of, I haven't examined it. I mean, it's so easy, wink, wink. It's so easy to get around this. I haven't examined Andrea Yates, but people who display these kinds of behavior in this kind of context with this kind of history, you could throw out a diagnosis, but what you're mostly concerned with is, well, what did it mean? What does it mean? Does it mean she knew what she was doing at the time? For what it's worth, she knew what she was doing, but she was prompted by delusions. So, what it's worth, I think that's not guilty by reason of insanity, which second time around she got that. But that's the way you do it.
I'm actually much more narrow about my willingness to speak about a public figure because even for the president, the personal mental health of the president is really not my business, or the public's right to know. But whether or not someone is a harm to the public, then it becomes a public health issue. So my being in violence studies, I think about dangerousness as being one area that I am worried about, and the seriousness of the signs that you put together to analyze the patterns and the likelihood of the probability of the danger that the public could be placed in. Those are the instances where I would speak up, and not so much as a commentary or a diagnosis of the public figure, but as a public health concern. And I think if one is in a public position, as the president is, then one ought to be also subject to that kind of scrutiny in a way that is intended to contribute to the collective good, including the public figure. And so I don't see it as that's the context in which I would speak, not so much to gratuitously comment on minor public figures, and I've refrained from that even as a forensic psychiatrist, even though forensic cases are exempt, because we often see
Okay,
public
so what if the diagnosis is, let's get to it, malignant narcissism? I mean, it's out there. It's out there. And so is this a medical judgment, or is this, as the 25th Amendment commentators seem to say, specifically, this is a political judgment? Yes? No? Not a, so who decides?
The politicians. They can get input from professionals, but
how do they know what kind of input they can receive? And
well, then they have to engage you, which is different from stepping forward, in my view, and saying, "Hey, I have some news."
No, I wouldn't do that in a consultational role, but I think I
book out
have
there, sitting right there.
Yes, I think
with
I
your
have an
name on it.
educative role to the public, directly to the public. And in fact, I stopped consulting with Congress members because I was only called upon by Democrats, and I wanted to, make clear that this was not.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because that's one of the reasons why it is so perilous to step forward, because you run the risk of, I mean, I know your motives are pure, so to speak, but is that you really, I think, run the risk of harming the profession as well, in the sense that, well, they're just, liberal psychiatrists who, of course, are going to, say something negative about the president or whoever.
So
and of course, we are all liberal psychiatrists. It is true, but
so you continue to educate that medical judgment. The first step of professionalism is that you bring neutrality to the situation. You don't bring your political affiliation, and when the condition is severe, you don't mitigate what you call it because of the political situation. And I actually take seriously the Physician's Pledge, the Declaration of Geneva, which was instituted after the experience of Nazism, which clarified that the role of a physician is to be humanitarian, that both silence and active cooperation with a destructive government could lead to atrocities. It was in direct recognition of that fact that silence also played a role. And silence on the part of mental health professionals when there is a national mental health crisis, I think, is a statement in itself.
What about the role of the White House physician in all of this? Is the White House physician, and I'm talking about going back even, is the White House physician essentially conflicted?
There's a lot of history of cover-up.
Sally?
Oh, you finished? Oh, okay. That's an interesting question. I have to admit, I really sort of don't know how they understand their job. I mean, any physician's responsibility to a patient is, acting in their best interest. So if you tell me, you come in with an ad for a medication that you saw in a magazine or, online, say, I want this, and I said, the thing is, if I give this to you, it will interact with something you're already on, or it's not indicated for your particular form of a condition because you have this added complication, whatever. But it's not necessarily gratifying the patient at all. And in psychiatry, that's often contraindicated. But obviously, they're both human beings, and there's a fondness for the person, I assume, and obviously some kind of loyalty. But I would think that the first, there's, again, duty to what's in the best interest of the patient, and then, I mean, I never worked in a White House, but I would imagine the chief of staff might say something to the doctor, who probably isn't going to be a psychiatrist. He's probably going to be an internist or something else. And hopefully he or she, the first thing he'd say is, I'm not sure, it's not my area of expertise, let me get my colleague in, or several of them. And this is all very difficult when it comes to character pathology or psychiatric conditions in general, because sometimes people don't have insight into the fact that they are afflicted. So it's not as if, the president says, or they'll just, oh my gosh, my knee is absolutely killing me, please come look at it. It's, what are you talking about? I'm fine. So it becomes very, very tough. But I would hope that the doctor does not let his personal fondness or political affiliation or that kind of thing interfere with the fact that he too is observing perhaps some difficulties, and that he's approached by someone else in the White House and says, we're concerned because this is the way the president is acting in meetings, is interacting with foreign leaders, is whatever. So
It's actually been written about a great deal, that there have been many instances of cover-up. President
don't doubt
Coolidge,
it.
for example, the White House physician was saying it was temperamental derangement, and nothing went out to the public, nothing was done. There are many instances, and you know, even as recently as the White House physician who was examining his employer as well as commander-in-chief, you know, how do you declare someone unfit? Well, in forensic situations, you ensure independence of the evaluator who is doing a fitness examination or a capacity evaluation. So that's actually different from diagnosing and treatment. So again, I would, I would make the distinction between the treater and the evaluator, and I think a bunch of articles have pondered over this and determined the White House physician would be the last person you would depend on for.
All right, we'll get to Representative Raskin's proposal on this, but I do want to ask a couple of other questions. According to the Coe study, I guess there's a 2006 study out of Duke, which said that 50% of presidents suffered from mental illness of one type or another, including depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. So, you know, based on what you're saying, Bandy, I mean, do we start to veer into territory in some cases where this could become politicized use of medicine as opposed to a political determination? Because clearly, if you have 50% of president, I mean, that creates an enormous field in which medical expertise could be utilized for political motives.
Well, I mean, first of all, diagnosis has nothing to do with functionality and capacities. That's a separate evaluation. So the fact that half the presidents have had a mental illness says nothing about their ability to perform their duties. And I'm of the camp, I know this actually is debated a great deal, but I am of the camp where I believe that the more information we have, the better. To put aside medical knowledge in fear that it might be weaponized or used for political purposes actually puts you in a domain where you're acting without information and all the more likely to be to politicize the situation. And I do believe that, you know, a reasonable group of medical professionals, given enough information, would come to a consensus that that's what we do in case conferences, that the medical standard of care. So I think a dearth of information may lead to biases and differences of opinion, but the more information we have, the better the chances of a consensus.
Sally?
what was the question exactly?
50%.
Oh, yeah, of course. No, I agree with you completely. A diagnosis does not imply disability, and not even, and believe it or not, probably you don't even have to have. So a diagnosis does not imply disability, and sometimes you may not even have a diagnosis at all, and it could mean you're unfit. Although we can always fit someone in the DSM somewhere. You know,
Okay.
as we get
So
them in.
I'm going to give you a hypothetical from another presidency. Jim Baker calls you, and the Gipper's acting strangely. He's forgetful, vague, and detached, unable to make decisions. He changes his mind easily. What do you do? It's, what did you call it when we talked about this? A curbside. A curbside, yeah. What do you do? What do you say? What happens?
Well, I'd say, did you have you talked to all the, you know, I could see how there's cover-ups and lots of potential conflicts that probably shouldn't exist, but do with the president's own doctor. Be interesting to have a retired presidential physician on this, but in any case.
Next time.
Yeah.
In the 2.0.
When there's not a congressional hearing on. I would say, but I would say, what does Dr. X, the doctor who's taking care of the president, think? And he might say, oh, he feels he's not qualified because he's a surgeon, to make any determination. And I'd say, well, is he open to having other professionals come in and help him think it through? One would hope the answer would be yes to that. And if not, I have to admit, I don't know exactly what sort of the mechanisms are, but there's certainly ample way to get advice from outside professionals. I mean, I don't know the mechanism to invoke that, but there are qualified people to call upon. That probably doesn't answer your question.
Well, but I guess the 25th Amendment.
Oh, I'm not in that. Right now, I'm in that penumbra of
the penumbra. All right, we're in the penumbra. Okay, so
before we even make
all
a decision.
Right. Well, apparently, and I'm not an expert on dementia.
But it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. If the official can't think clearly, is erratic, can't sustain his attention, who cares what the diagnosis is at that point? You just know this person is not able to do his job. And that's what kicks off the mechanism. Then, of course, you care about him as a human being, and we want to, what's wrong, and can we treat this, and will it resolve? That's almost on a different parallel plane. They're not completely divorced, but they really are just pretty distinct, I would say.
Yep.
Are you mentioning about a situation where someone is a danger to oneself or others?
Well, I mean, that's the political, political judgment, right? Because does that constitute a danger? Ken Baker and Meese, and can they cover adequately? Is that appropriate? Does that serve the interests of the public? I mean, when Mrs. Wilson, after President Wilson had a stroke, she basically ran the show for at least the second half of his second term. Does that serve the interests of the American public? I mean, these are all big questions. These are fundamentally political questions, right?
Yes.
Right,
but
right.
But I'd say, if we disagree, I'd say they're not questions for psychiatrists. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a very interesting question. You may have someone who maybe where the resistance within the White House, so to speak, is truly trying to undermine what's going on, or you might have a scenario in which the person is so beloved that people are compensating like mad, and the really problematic behaviors really don't they keep them a bit out of the spotlight, and the problem behaviors aren't filtering to the public view, and yet everyone else is managing to make the trains run on time. But the president, I suppose, in a case like that, really isn't discharging his duties, and yet the government is working. I don't know what that means, but.
So HR 1967, which is Representative Raskin's bill, would establish, as I understand it, a standing committee of mental health professionals. And Bandy, I don't know if you feel qualified to discuss what that would involve and what the intention of that would be.
I know he consulted me on this, but I don't really remember the exact terms, except for this other body would be a mixture of political people and medical people. And what I had said to him in response was that the medical community ought to have their own expert panel, which is purely of medical professionals, not there to determine whether or not to invoke the 25th Amendment, but simply there to give an independent, objective medical opinion as to, I've been advocating for pre-screening every presidential and vice presidential candidate, even before they go through the election process. And this body can continue to evaluate the president's and vice president's fitness for duty on an annual basis based on the information that is available. Perhaps there might be instances where they would call for an examination because they see serious signs of concerns, but they would consult with the commission that is formed for political reasons, and whether that commission has medical professionals on the board or not, I guess that would either way is fine from my perspective. But I would try to reproduce the consultative role that that medical professionals have with legal decision making for the political decision making.
Okay, and I misspoke. It's HR 1987. Garrett, I'm sure you can run right out and take a look. So it's 1987, 1967, which I had on the brain because that was the year of ratification of the 25th.
And Goldwater Amendment, too.
Okay.
That committee is, my recollection is supposed to have 11 members, a chairman, an elder statesman, 2 other, I guess, unnamed people, and 2 more, and then 8 physicians, half of whom have to be psychiatrists. And I would, I understand the 25th Amendment, stipulates that such a body can be formed, so it certainly would have no objection to the formation of such a body if you want to keep it ongoing or temporary. But in any case, I wouldn't have one doctor on it. I think we have to cement both the symbolism and the reality that the physicians are in the consultative role. And so I would have that body be all political people, but they would have ready access and should take advantage of a side group, an advisory group of clinicians.
I'm going to interrupt Dan before you go. So I'm just going to, my good colleague Dan Glickman, a former member of Congress, if you could just share with us, do you think that there will be any interest, any appetite in the Congress, whether before or after the midterms, in considering this, or is this such a third rail that there is no chance that this goes any further?
I'm sorry I didn't get to hear you talk beforehand. I don't think there's going to be much interest before the midterms. But there's a lot of interest in subsidiary issues, the whole command and control system and how undeveloped it really is. Who has his or her finger really on the button? What are the procedures there to keep us from being annihilated? There are various levels of risk. The most serious risk is destruction of the earth. Then there's destruction of our financial system. There are all sorts of potential risks to the country. And I do think that there is a growing interest in Congress to look at this and realize that Article I branch of government is the Congress, not the executive branch. And the Congress needs to take an active role in talking about these issues. Unfortunately, it's very political right now because it all looks like it's Trump. And the whole issue is Trump. And is he off the edge? And should we be talking about it in this context? And perhaps we should, but the more serious issue has to do with our separation of powers and recognizing that Congress must address this issue more generically than it has in the past and not be afraid of the political consequences to it. And I think there are people on both sides of the aisle that want to do that. That's the best answer I can give you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Sorry to...
All right, we'll give Finley the last question, and then I promised everybody that it would be now.
I think Secretary Glickman's observations are very helpful. I think it's important to understand that this takes place within a political context. And I would just simply submit that in the present circumstance, if you get within whispering distance of invoking the 25th Amendment, you're going to be asking for civil disorder on a range that it is impossible to imagine right now. That, I think, is the reality of where we are.
All right, well, thank you, everybody, for being with us. And I want to thank our 2 speakers, Bandy Lee and Sally Satel, Dr. Bandy Lee and Dr. Sally Satel.